Serious. What is the most terrifying thing to happen to you in a well-lit and populated place? When I was little, I used to play the hi game, where you would wave to strangers as you drove by. When with a group of friends, you'd try to get the most people to wave hi back to you. One time my mom stopped to buy some flowers and had left my friends and I in the car. For some reason, one of my friends decided to keep playing the game while we were parked, which is obviously against the rules, but this isn't the time for technicalities. So she waves to this dude and he comes over and the very first thing he says is, "So, where's your mom?" To me as a kid, something about the way he said it was terrifying. We all thought we were done. Turns out he was just concerned and somehow ended up tracking my mom down. But those few moments immediately after he said that were terrifying. I'm a little late to this party, but here goes. I was on a 300-mile ride on my motorcycle when I stopped for gas at a sketchy gas station. While I'm stopped, this homeless guy in a puffy ratty fur jacket and a Flava Flav-style Viking hat rides up on his bicycle with a milk crate for a basket and a homemade trailer. He rings the bell on his handlebar and tells me I have a nice bike as I'm walking in to pay. I say, "Thanks, you too, bud." And he charges at me on foot and pushes me from behind hard and says, "No man, I said you have a nice bike." I'm freaking out now because this dude looks high as heck on something hard, and though I'm not a small dude, I've heard drugs make you fight hella crazy. So I push this guy to the ground and yell for him to back the F up, and he gets up, adjusts his hat, and says, "This is what you wear when you want to sing Immigrant Song by Led Zeppelin." Then he runs to his bike like a madman and rides off. Most terrifying and hilarious thing to ever happen to me. Too long didn't read, cranked out homeless dude attacked me in a parking lot. May have been Robert Plant. This is actually very funny if you can just read it and don't have to participate in it. Well, I hope my ahs were good enough that scary bicycle riding Robert Plant doesn't come find me and push me down. I don't even have a nice bike to appease him with. When I was 3, someone tried to kidnap me from a shopping center. I had been standing next to my mom when some random guy grabbed me by the wrist and started making a fast move to the exit. Even nearly 30 years later, I can still remember this vividly, from what he looked like to being too scared to say anything as I was being let out whilst frantically trying to look for my mom. Luckily enough, Mom had spotted me and screamed as we were near the exit, and he let me go and ran out. I had nightmares about the man with the yucky eyes for years after this. I have an almost 3-year-old. If someone tried to snatch her from near me, they are leaving on a stretcher. I was at a city festival, around 10,000 people. 10 to 15 gangbangers started harassing me thinking I'm someone else. I asked cop after cop to help me. Because they hadn't touched me yet, they technically have done nothing wrong. All at once, they are all on me. A group of white supremacists come to my aid. One even stabbed a gangbanger to death when he pulled a gun. I was knocked unconscious and didn't see it, but because of my testimony about what happened before they got involved, all charges were dropped. I'm not sure what is scarier, being attacked by people or feeling like you owe anything to white supremacists. Frankly, I think I would have preferred getting my butt kicked. The hospital. Called 911 because my mom had a seizure. At hospital in the ridiculous bright light, and the doctor comes in and says they found a brain tumor. Texted my sister immediately, and then moments later I could hear her sobbing in the waiting area from where I was. The beginning of the end. When I was living in Geneva, one day I got a craving for something from home. So naturally, I went to McDonald's and got some fries/pommes frites. I'm sitting outside with my frites when I notice some chaos and cacophony coming across the bridge. Looks like it's a WTO protest, complete with tractors and black bloc protesters throwing bricks and firebombs. This is odd. Geneva is usually quiet, tidy, and calm. I get up and start walking away from the McDonald's to try to get to a different part of the city, not realizing how wild this was about to get. As they get closer, things start getting real. They smash out storefronts, light cars on fire, and the Swiss police form a police line behind me. I am now stuck between black bloc protesters and irritated police. I get up and start moving quickly down the street as both parties are closing in on me and start inhaling a mix of burning car and some sort of gas. I'm not sure if it was tear gas or some sort of improvised smoke bomb from the protesters. People are yelling and it's loud as heck. I round a corner and run right into about 12 Swiss police who are preparing to set up a cordon to corral the protesters into a more controllable part of the city and start asking them to please let me through. They tense up and stare at me. Then one of them grabs me by the shoulder and sort of flings me behind them, and then they move on. I'm in the clear and it's immediately quiet with clean air and a free path back to a streetcar. It was pretty scary at the time. Now it's just interesting. A guy tried to drag me to his room when I was sick and confused at a con, pulled me right through the lobby. The only reason I didn't end up in his room is because I couldn't think of how to get away, so I just sat right down in the middle of the lobby and he couldn't pick me back up again. No one helped. My friend came back from pulling the car around and found me sitting there. Thankfully, they helped me into the car, and that was that. Hey folks, if you see someone who looks scared or just not quite right at a con or event, it doesn't hurt to ask, "Hey, you all right?" Simple question like that can help a person out more than you might realize, and if they are all right, no harm done. Was in Chicago last year for a conference and brought my friend who was slightly terrified of urban areas. Keep in mind, we are from rural Iowa. Had to use the subway to get to the conference when suddenly a fight broke out in the car in front of us. They moved the fight throughout most of the train and started to flash guns at one point in our car. Luckily for us, a brave young fellow helped break it up and no one was seriously injured, but my friend legitimately thought there was about to be a shooting. I used to take those classes at a Catholic church in the evening. I was put ahead into an older kid class. I believe I was 8 and most of them were pre-teens or early teens. This one guy, 14 or 15, kept offering me money for a BJ, which at the time I had no idea what it was. A bunch of other girls would always swarm me when he was nearby and tell me to ignore him, not take the money, etc. He was known as a troublemaker. I asked my parents what a BJ was, so they found out and made a complaint. His family gave a lot of money to that church, so nothing happened to him. Then I got to church early and was just roaming around. He was there and got physical with me. I didn't really understand at the time, but now I realize he was likely trying to arm me. I called out for others to help, but absolutely no one did. A few adults would stop and watch, but then they'd keep walking. Thankfully, my older sister ran into us and put a stop to everything, so ultimately nothing happened. He got kicked out after that. I understand not getting involved, but no one even called the cops. I do not understand not getting involved. If you see something like that, especially with a 15-year-old and a kid, you step in and put a stop to things. I'm not sure if a report to the police would help, but I would do it. On the 3rd of this month, in a very well-lit hospital room, my hospitalist came to my bedside after 9 days in the hospital to tell me a blood smear and flow cytometry pointed to me having a T-cell non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, that I needed a bone marrow biopsy to confirm. The oncologist came to visit my room and tell me my spleen was also enlarged and, in her best opinion, I had likely a stage 4. If the bone marrow came back and she thought it would, T-cell lymphoma. That I would start chemo the day after the results came back, that it would be 2 rounds of that therapy, and if I did not respond, they would get ready for bone marrow transplant. Asked me if I had siblings. She said the type she thinks I have is very aggressive, as it did not show in my lymph nodes but was already showing symptoms in my spleen and liver. Apparently, this is very bad. I have 3 children, 11, 9, and 7. I love them dearly and could not stop thinking of them. It put so many things into perspective for me. I cried, my family cried. I became extremely negative. The day of the 19th, the oncologist came into my room. They had some bone marrow results. It all came out quickly. She was now saying the cells looked to be reactive to an atypical infection and the pathologist saw no clonal cells. She said there was still a PCR pending that would rule out up to 99% that I was safe, but sent me home. I'm now waiting for my appointment Tuesday for the all clear. I'm very, very fatigued. I contracted C. diff while in due to heavy antibiotic use. I'm very, very, very tired. My anxiety is through the roof every second. I can't stop researching cancer. I'm scared to live. I'm just so scared. I work in a pathology lab where we receive blood and bone marrow to test flow cytometry on. My job is to transcribe the findings to the pathologists into a report. Your comment just made me realize how real these things are and how desensitized we can be when we're not face to face with the actual patient. I wish you nothing but the best, and I hope everything turns out okay. A guy felt me up on an extremely crowded peak hour bus. I totally froze. Couldn't bring myself to move a muscle as his hand slid up the bare skin of my inner thigh. I was wearing a skirt. It was an odd experience. I never expected myself to react like that. I always imagined that if something like that happened, I'd shove them off or call them out or something, but I didn't. I didn't do anything. Okay. My experience isn't quite the same, but I'm willing to share here because I do understand that last part. Mainly facts guy about to get a little real, and it's a long one. Sorry to my editor. I was in a grocery store and a man confronted me because I had painted nails. He kicked my basket and stood in front of me and said, "Want to see something?" I didn't know what this was about at the moment and just said, okay. He showed me a news video of gay people in other countries being whipped for being gay, then said, "There are good things happening in the world," and indicated my fingernails. Note, I'm pan, not gay, but I doubt he would have cared. Once I pieced together his point, I eventually just barely managed to say, "That seems cruel. I hope you find some peace," and tried to walk away. He came at me, shoved me into a shelf, stared at me like he was deciding if he would do more, then walked away repeating his "good things" line. I'm a decent-sized guy, look kinda tough, and always thought I would never let anyone mess with me, but in that moment, I was scared and barely got words out, and honestly was shaking the rest of the day. I guess the point I'm trying to make to the OP and anyone else dealing with these kinds of stories is you can't blame yourself for not reacting in those situations. My situation wasn't nearly as frightening as yours, and I could barely say anything. If you didn't react, don't blame yourself. But if you can react, I hope you can protect yourself, get help, anything. When I was living in Paris, I was attacked in the Bastille metro station during the early evening, while in a group of 5 to 6 girls. The guy followed us off the train and onto an escalator and placed himself right behind my friend. She went around me farther up the escalator to get away from him. He tried to follow her. Being fluent in French, I put my arm out to block him and told him to leave her alone. He then grabbed my arm so hard that I later had fingerprint bruises. And then he just stared at me. It was terrifying. I was telling him to get off and leave me alone, all while trying to pry his fingers off me, and there was just no emotion or reaction on his face. Luckily then, my friend just above me turns and sees this, and full-on falcon kicks this guy right on the chest. He fell back a bit, but caught himself, then grabbed her by the ponytail and punched her in the face. By this point, we're finally at the top of the escalator. Yes, this all transpired in the duration of an escalator ride, and a group of men chased this guy off. I love you, Paris, but frick did the men there harass the crap out of me. It's apparently a prevalent problem there. I was alone at the park and I was either 5 or 6, and these girls in grade 8, there was 3 of them, started yelling at me to get off a swing I was sitting on. Apparently, it was their swing. I just sat there and stared at the sand because I was terrified until one of the girls walked behind me and then violently pushed me off the swing. Then they proceeded to kick me, throw sand at me, and shove my face in the sand till I couldn't see and barely breathe. Then they took off my shoes and threw them in a tall tree. They were those Mary Jane shoes, Powerpuff Girls wore them, and my mother had just bought them for me 2 days ago. I walked home barefoot crying and not one person did anything. The park I was at was surrounded by apartment buildings. I'm sure somebody saw. I never felt so helpless in my life. Was walking down the sidewalk on a busy street holding my 4-year-old son's hand. He suddenly shouted, "Yay!" and pulled away from me to jump 2 feet in the water at the curb. Just then, a bus was pulling over to the bus stop in front of us. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I lunged forward, too late, but the observant bus driver did a quick yanking back on her steering wheel, and the bus went exactly around my son, no room to spare, and still pulled into the bus stop. I pulled my son back to the sidewalk, started crying and yelling at him, which scared him, so he cried. Then I hugged him, so relieved he was still alive. By The time I looked up, the bus was gone. What scared me the most was that no one else noticed and it was over in 2 minutes. Those 120 seconds could have changed my life forever, but since no one else witnessed it, it was like it didn't happen. How many other times has stuff like this happened? Thank you, bus driver, wherever you are. You had to be watching far in advance. Look, there's a squirrely kid up there. I better be ready in case he crap! One morning, I was sitting in a cafe waiting for a friend. At the table next to me, there was a Chinese exchange student who obviously just came into the city and didn't speak our language. Some guy walked up to her, sat next to her, groped her, and said very nasty things. I said, "Hey, that's not cool. I don't think that you're welcome at this place anymore. Get out of here." Then he got to me, tried to shove me, and said, "What do you want from me? Let's get out. I will beat you up, you butthole." I got a bit louder, but finally he went out. Thing is, the cafe was half full. It was 10 a.m. and no one cared what happened to that girl or me. And no one even thought of calling the police. Pretty crappy of these people. I was standing on a bus during London's morning rush. It was an absolute crush, nowhere to move. I felt a boner press into the back of me, so I shouted for the driver to stop the bus. He promptly ignored me. I had absolutely nowhere to go. I was trapped. And then this man reached under my skirt and tried to stick his fingers up my V, so I kept shouting what was happening. No one on the bus did anything. The driver wouldn't stop, so I struggled with this man who, by that time, was holding me by the crotch and licking me. So the next stop, Warren Street, the doors open and I ran. This man chased me until he caught me and put me in a bear hug and kept telling me he was going to arm me then and there in broad daylight. I threatened to stab him in the eye with my keys in my hand and pressing into his eye, and he backed off. I kept shouting for people to call the police. I didn't have a mobile at the time, and people just kept walking past. So I ran to work. The police thankfully took me very seriously. They said that the CCTV systems on the bus weren't working at the time, so it would be difficult to identify my assailant. A week later, this same bus was bombed in 7/7. I wasn't on it because I was terrified that some man would do this again. That certainly isn't to say that I would have been on that exact bus at that exact time it was blown up, but I also know that the CCTV wasn't working, making it harder for the police to identify the bomber. It was the absolute helplessness I felt, whereby every person around me watched but didn't do anything. Hundreds of people, passerby, the bus driver, my fellow passengers on the bus, all pretended that it wasn't happening. The terror of what happened in that instant didn't stick around, thankfully, but the mistrust of the bystander effect keeps me on my guard 11 years later. It also means that whenever I see people in trouble, I make a point of helping instead of standing idly by. I will not allow anything like this to happen to anybody else. It has gotten me in sticky situations, but I don't want another person feeling the helplessness that I did. Folks, I know it's scary, and sometimes directly engaging might lead to violence, so please be careful, but do something. Don't just stand by and let someone be assaulted. Call the police, get other people involved. Just do something. On a crowded bus, and a drunk older man corners me, talks to me until I take my earbuds out, then asks about the book I'm reading, and before I can realize what I'm dealing with, he takes it out of my hand and starts telling me how beautiful and yummy he thinks I am. I'm trying to get my crap back, and he won't stop telling me how he could just eat me up, I'm delicious, etc. I'm attempting to be just polite enough that I don't set him off, but firm enough to get him to leave me alone. At one point, I look around and see all these people staring at me, and nobody did anything. It was a double-length bus, so the driver was clueless. I got off at a random stop because I didn't want him to know my real stop. Thankfully, he did not follow me. I had to call my work and tell them I was going to be late. This probably isn't on par with everyone else's post, but when I was visiting a long-distance boyfriend in New York City, we were waiting to cross the street in Times Square, and while traffic is going, he proceeds to push me towards it and then pull me back onto the sidewalk. That happened a few more times while I visited him. It wasn't even playful. When I asked him why he did that, he just laughed. I went to my local library, which is very large. I was in the reference section, which is a bit secluded, looking for books about writing. I noticed a shady-looking man following me up and down the aisles. I got a little nervous because I was pretty far from the desk or anyone else that I could see. Once he saw me notice him and that I was walking faster, he ran at me and slammed me into a shelf, smelling my neck and grabbing a fistful of my hair. He reeked of alcohol. I screamed. Lots of people came running, security and the police were called. I was later told by their security liaison that perhaps if I had dressed differently, it wouldn't have happened, tank top and shorts. I was so dazed, I just stared at him and the female officer said, "Are you freaking kidding me?" It was so scary and surreal. In situations like this, best I can say is keys in hand, sticking out between the fingers like Wolverine's claws, and you just friggin' go for the eyes or neck. Any guy who says that is too harsh can eat dirt. I got mugged in broad daylight in Flushing Meadows. It was 10 a.m. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see people who saw what was happening and just turned away. Junior high, first year, 85-pound loner book gal. Get followed by much larger 150-plus pound boy. Boy kicks legs out from under me. I pick up books, walk on. Boy shoves me face forward. I get to my feet and continue. Boy's enraged by my lack of resistance. Punches me between back of head and neck. Everything flies, sunny colors. Stumble and struggle to pick up papers, books, etc. There were at least 15 or 20 kids watching this unfold. No one helped. No one said a word. I was lucky that I wasn't knocked out or hurt worse, but I lost a lot of faith in humanity that day. Now, still lose hope in people, but work as tech and ER, and there's always at least one thing that makes your heart melt and feel like life's more than worth it. Everyone's lives are worth it. Trouble is, you can't be scared to intervene when needed. Most terrifying. Well-lit and populated. Okay, 4th grade on the playground after lunch, a kid from a different 4th grade class pulled a big butt kitchen knife out of his backpack. It was wavy and serrated and had forks on the end. Apparently, he hated the gigantic, for a 4th grader, black guy that was in my class. So he's screaming and swinging the knife in big arcs in front of him, and everyone else near the big toy basically loses their crap and runs for it. I want to help, but I'm small and nearly crapping my pants in horror. I'm behind the knife guy and he starts lunging and actually trying to stab the other guy. I'd like to think I was about to do something, but who knows? Right then, the black guy steps toward the knife guy and the knife actually slices his left bicep, but the black guy is huge in comparison and still manages to wrestle the knife guy to the ground and sit on him until the adults show up, less than a minute start to end. About a month later, I started my first Taekwondo class. The black kid showed amazing restraint. I hope he didn't get in trouble for fighting. See, now that is a situation where you probably shouldn't jump in because then it's just you getting stabbed, but you still scream for help, find someone, something. I'm glad that kid is okay. I walked out of the subway in New York City on a warm, sunny September day and found it was cloudy and snowing. It was 9/11. Over the next 5 minutes, I learned the World Trade Center towers had been hit by planes and the snow was actually ash from the collapse of the first tower. Well, about 4 years ago, a fighter jet crashed into my apartment complex and almost blew me up. Thank goodness for the creation of walls. I used to work on self-scan tills at a busy supermarket. I fainted behind one of the tills, woke up a few minutes later as a customer was stepping over me. Asked to go home because I obviously wasn't well, was told nobody had seen me go down, so it didn't count. An hour later, the same thing happened again as a manager was walking past. It was another 3 hours before my shift ended, and I had to keep running between these 10 tills until then. I'm lucky I never hit my head on the way down. I handed my notice in that week. In 2nd grade, I was playing at recess in a sandbox with a kid that lived around the corner from my house when this other kid walked up with what I can only describe as a gang of 1st graders. There were probably about 10 of them. They split us up and 3 or 4 went with my friend to the far corner of the sandbox while the rest dragged me out under a tree more in the center of the playground. Now, it's worth noting that I have a connective tissue disorder called Marfan syndrome. The short version is that I have a defect in my DNA for coding something that holds my connective tissue together, and as a result, I have always been very tall. I'm 6'7" now, and extremely skinny, but also very incapable of physical activity. It also means that taking a good hit from, say, contact sports could cause my aorta to rupture, and I'd quite possibly die of internal bleeding before an ambulance showed up. So they started trying to pin me to the ground and dragged me out while I was flailing and screaming, and the next thing I know, one kid is assigned to each of my legs and the others are taking turns literally jumping on my groin and punching my face. punching my chest, and I'm screaming for help because I know all that stuff about Marfans, and what must have been the whole recess period full of kids is just circled around me watching. The bell rings to end recess and everyone scatters, and a few minutes later some teacher runs out and helps me to my feet. Turns out those kids also knew I had a heart problem. When I got called up to the principal the next day, he asked what happened, and that leader kid, who happened to live just next door to my friend, said that his dad had said, "Weak shoots like me deserve to die, and besides, I was annoying." The principal threw his nameplate at the kid hard enough that it actually stuck into the wall where it hit. I did a 180 on my personality that day. Used to say hi to everyone, probably said no more than 10 words to anyone other than a teacher or my closest friends until high school, and certainly was afraid to go outside for a while with that kid in my neighborhood. Holy crap, how is a first grader that awful? I mean, obviously the parent had something to do with it, but that is just heartbreaking to hear. I think of kids that age just being a little cruel, but never to that degree. Was a zookeeper in a major city and cleaning the bison pen. Somehow the biggest of the three got between me and the truck without me noticing, huffed once, and charged me. Managed to vault over the 10-foot gate as she crashed into it, missing me by half a second. This was in the middle of summer with about 40 onlookers, most of whom were children. Never went beyond 5 feet from the truck again. Too long didn't read, almost eviscerated by a bison in front of children. I was pretty close to a lightning about 36 years ago, and by pretty close, I mean less than 10 feet from it. Was with family in an older hotel, the Pocono Mountains. We had a thunderstorm roll through after dinner. I just stepped out of my room at the hotel and was going to walk to my parents' room 2 doors down. Just as I stepped out of my room, the bolt struck ground in the courtyard, followed by the loudest bang I had ever heard. There was this smell of burnt ozone, a patch on the ground where the rainwater had been vaporized and was bone dry again. I swear that the bolt appeared to be as thick as a tree trunk, and the sound of the bolt was like the Tesla coil I heard at the Franklin Institute in Pennsylvania. My parents said I literally levitated into the room and that all of the hair on my body was standing on end, and when my father touched me, I discharged a static spark like I had been running on wool carpet for the last 2 days. It's a vivid memory, and I sure do take care when I'm out in severe weather. My mother having a panic attack. I think I was 12 or 13. It got easier to deal with after that, but the first one was nightmarish. Saw how 2 hitmen in a motorcycle shot a guy walking right next to the restaurant I was in. I was probably 13 years old. Come to think of it, fear wasn't the strongest emotion, though. I was furious. I couldn't believe how someone could take a life so easily. London bombings in 2005. My friends and I were leaving the hostel to get to the airport. Somehow the tube had just been shut down and we had to take the bus. Inside the packed bus, a man started screaming that other buses had blown up and we should leave immediately. The people didn't react with panic, but with silence, and to me, that was pretty terrifying. When I was 16, my then boyfriend and I were violently mugged by 4 young men and 1 girl in the center of the city we lived in. It was around 5 p.m. Lots of people around, leaving work, etc. No one did anything. They held me down on the ground and they beat my boyfriend for not giving up his bag right away. We managed to flag down a police car after they had run off. No one stopped to help us. I tried to ask a woman to call the police, but she didn't let me speak, shaking her head and walking faster. The only one of the gang of 5 who got caught was the girl. Her mother was found by my boyfriend's passport and MP3 player in her possession and turned her into the police. She was only 15. I was 14 years old and in high school. I was on my period, but I'm also pretty easily distracted, so I didn't change my tampon in time. Long story short, the whole class saw my bloody jeans and made fun of me because I pooped myself. Years after, some buttholes still called me Poopy Pants. I was 8 years old and playing at the schoolyard after school with a couple of other kids I didn't know. One of the older boys, 13 maybe, looked at the little girl I vaguely remembered from another class, then he looks at me. He reaches into his waistband and pulls out a handgun. Me. Wow, we're friends, right? Him. Yeah, we're cool. Me. You sure? Him. Yeah. Nope, the frick out of there. There was some investigation into the kid. Turned out he didn't go to the school there. Nobody knew who he was. I had my bag with wallet etc. inside, ripped off my shoulder by a man on a motorcycle in broad daylight with many people about. In Saigon, it's not uncommon. A couple of weeks ago, I went to Walmart in the burbs with my fiancée. We split up and I went to go grab some bread. A burly guy with his girlfriend pushed his shopping cart by me. He waited until he was right up next to me and he said in an aggressive tone, "I'm going to frickin' stab you in the back." I was minding my own business and never even made eye contact. Something about the way he said it was chilling. I'm about 5'5", 140 pounds, and he must have been at least 6 foot 220 pounds. It's crazy to think someone would threaten to kill a stranger for no apparent reason in the middle of a crowded store. People like this, as I've experienced, feel like they can get away with it because, as we've seen in so many of these stories, they apparently can. People just turn a blind eye to this stuff, and that is sad and terrifying. Nearly trampled in a crowded street carnival. Those articles you read about tightly packed crowds suddenly moving as an unstoppable fluid? Yeah, immediate sense of terror and panic. When I was around 11, I was in a grocery store with my friend and her parents, maybe 7 p.m. in a nice part of town. While the parental unit shopped, we giggled over JTT and Tiger Beat magazine in the magazine aisle. Then we noticed him. Guy in his 30s, brown hair, very intense look on his face, and a giant uncircumcised dong in his hand. We backed away and went from aisle to aisle looking for the parents. He kept following and getting closer, still exposing himself. At the front of the store, we found an employee and approached them, and he bolted out the door. Maybe not as violent or scary as some stories here, but it freaked me out. 25 years, and I still remember. I really think that dude intended to grab one of us. I remember how both my friend and I were silent the whole time, gripping hands, walking through that bright, weirdly empty grocery store. 13-year-old female student with a tragic family history that kind of explains her feelings, handing me a letter in the middle of class detailing precisely what she would like me to do to her and asking if there was a way to contact me outside of district email. She just stood in front of me watching me read it, and I do mean I was standing in the middle of my classroom. Working in a profession where one unstable kid can make a completely unfounded accusation and cost you your career, reputation, and even friends and family is freaking scary. When I was about 15, I was waiting for a bus home when a hobo asked me for a cigarette. I don't smoke, so I just apologized for not smoking and offered him some change to buy some, as it was the best I could do. He took it, then asked for a cigarette, this time threatening to break my nose if I didn't give one to him. Before I could react, he beat the living frick out of me. No one helped me until a family friend happened to walk past who managed to find out that the mangled, bloody mess on the floor was me. I ended up in a hospital, and after a lengthy process of getting the guy arrested, positively identifying him, and extensive interviews before and after said identification, the police let him go. I stopped going into town and moved away as soon as I could. Frick Cambridgeshire Police. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.